Good evening to all of you who have joined this webinar. I must thank the President of the Chamber, Vipul Bhai, convener of the study circle, Ashok Sharma ji, and Dilip Bhai, and other office bearers of the Chamber for organizing this webinar and giving me an opportunity to be again amongst you to share my thoughts. In February, as you would recollect, after the budget, we had a study circle related to the budget proposals, where I had substituted for my senior, Praful Poladia, because he was at that time busy with the VSV, Vivad Se Vishwas scheme related, work. Uh, After at the enactment stage, there were a lot of amendments made, and new surprises have come in the form of equalization levy. So therefore, the chamber thought it fit to have another, the follow-on session where we will try to understand what amendments have happened at the enactment stage of the Finance Bill 2020. We have to keep in mind that this finance bill has already been enacted. It is now a law. It has received a presidential assent on 27th of March. So it is a law as of date. But there are more than 50 amendments which are made at the enactment stage, and because of the extraordinary situation, there was no debate or discussion in the Lok Sabha while passing the amendments. And the another handicap that we have is that, unlike the budget proposals where you have an explanatory memorandum, notes to clauses indicating the policy intent of each and every amendment, this time we don't have that kind of a document, and which is more importantly for the equalization levy, understanding why the equalization levy has been brought about. So we only have the fine print before us, and from that we have to figure out what could be the scope, what could be the ambit of this new tax. As Sharma ji has pointed out, we will divide the discussion in three parts. The first part will be understanding the amendments at the enactment stage of the Finance Bill 2020, other than the equalization levy and e-commerce transactions. In the second part, we will try to see, or we will discuss the short-term reliefs which the government has introduced in order to meet the challenges which are arising due to COVID-19. And the third is the equalization levy. So we have three separate segments before us. So let me, without taking much further time, let me start off. So we are on the first part, which is the amendments to the Finance Bill 2020 at enactment stage. Now, I may again repeat, if anybody has any query, I would request you to type in the query in the question and answer box. And at the end of each segment, I will try to answer it. If the query has already been answered during my discussion, so I will skip it, and time permitting, I will answer the rest of the queries. The presentation, the PPT, I will circulate it to Ashok ji and Dilip Bhai after the end of this webinar, and then it will be put up on the website. So there are certain amendments regarding the dividend taxation. Uh, the change was the most important change which the budget brought about, was reverting to the classical system of dividend taxation in the hands of the shareholders. Now, because this was a very, very comprehensive change, a lot of amendments were required. So naturally, in that process, some anomalies had crept in. So at the enactment stage, some of these anomalies have been sought to be addressed. So the first one is that, under the classical system, the tax is on the shareholder. The shareholder has to pay tax on the dividend income, and the company does not have to pay DDT. And in the DDT regime, there was one super rich tax, that is residents who were receiving dividend income more than 10 lakh rupees, they had to pay an extra 10% tax. Now, the exemption comes in from 1st April 2020. So any dividend which is received after 1st of April 2020 is exempt. But the question arose, what about the transitional dividend? That is dividends which are are declared before 31st of March 2020 by the company, but received after 31st of March by the shareholder. So here the company will have to pay DDT on such dividend, and therefore there was an apprehension whether it will suffer both the DDT in the hands of the company and the normal tax in the hands of the shareholder. So this anomaly has been addressed at the enactment stage by making an amendment in the proviso to the 1034 section 1034 by providing that it will be such dividend which is which is declared before 31st of March but received by the shareholder after 1st of April will be exempt in the hands of the shareholder, provided the DDT or the super rich tax, if applicable, has been paid. So if DDT and super rich tax is applicable, then it has to be paid. Then the shareholder will get exemption and he does not have to pay normal tax. Now, the date for payment is not specified. That is the DDT as well as the super rich tax. DDT to be paid by the company, super rich tax paid to be paid by the shareholder has to be paid by the respective due dates and not necessarily by 31st of March 2020. If there is a delay in that payment, then either the company or the shareholder will be liable to interest, penalties, etc. But once it has been paid, then the shareholder can enjoy the exemption on that dividend income. The second anomaly, which was there in the budget proposal, was that for non-residents, the dividend was taxable, but TDS rates were not provided. Specific TDS rates were not provided. The final rate under 115A is 20%, but there was no amendment in Part 2 of the first schedule to the finance bill for providing this 20% rate. So consequently, what had happened was such dividends would have been liable to TDS at 30 to 40%, whichever is applicable to that non-resident. Now this anomaly has been addressed at the enactment stage, where Part 2 of first schedule has been amended to provide for TDS rate of 20% on dividends paid to the non-residents plus applicable surcharge and cess. So the TDS will be at 20% plus surcharge and cess if the non-resident is not claiming any treaty benefit. If the non-resident is claiming a treaty benefit, then subject to availability of the treaty benefit, the rates will be lower. The next anomaly or a policy issue was that because of the reversal to the classical system of taxation, the dividend income would become just like normal income, taxable in the hands of the residents and the non-residents. For the residents, last year, the surcharge rate had been increased. So for incomes between 2 crore to 5 crore, a 25% surcharge was introduced. For incomes in excess of 5 crore, a 37% surcharge was introduced. So the effective tax for the residents on the dividend income would have been 42.74, highest tax. For the non-residents who are liable to tax at 20%, with the surcharge and highest surcharge and cess, it would have been 28.5%. So there have been a very high incidence of tax on the dividends. So there was an ask from the the stakeholders that for the residents, the tax rates need to be at least reduced. At the enactment stage, it has been partially addressed, not fully addressed, by reducing the surcharge rate 10%. This applies to both residents as well as non-residents for TDS as well as advanced tax purposes, but it is linked to the wherever the rates are prescribed are rates in force. So section 195 provides for TDS at rates in force, and rates in force under section 237A leads you to the finance bill. So, and then to part 2. So wherever the rates in force are applicable, for advanced tax purposes, you need to go to part 3. So wherever the rates in force are applicable, the surcharge rate on the dividend will be 15%. So because of that, for residents, the effective maximum tax rate on the dividend income will be 35.88%, even if their total income exceeds 2 crore. So take an example where dividend is 2 crore, other income is, the 3 crore. So on 3 crore, the 25% surcharge gets triggered. but on the dividend income, it would still be 15%. Now there would be some issue about that initial slabs, 250 and the 10 lakh, etc. That will comprise of what? How you can calculate that surcharge? So my personal view is, now here you can take whichever is more beneficial. So in this this example where the other income is 3 crore, dividend income is 2 crore, it will be more beneficial to take the slabs initially as comprised of the other income, such that the end for the dividend income it goes under 30% and you can claim 15% surcharge. So the maximum tax rate is 35.88%. While this amendment has been carried out wherever the dividend is taxable at rates in force, there is no corresponding amendment wherever a specific TDS or a final tax has been provided on such dividend income. And this has given rise to certain mismatches in respect of dividends paid to non-residents. These mismatches can be of two types, where on the TDS there is a lower surcharge, but on the final tax there is a higher surcharge, or at both TDS as well as at the final tax there would be a higher surcharge. So these cases has been illustrated in the table on the slide before you. So take in the first two categories. So let us say there is an FDI or an NRI investor or a unit holder in a category 1 or category 2 alternative investment fund, where the TDS is at rates in force at 20%, then there is a lower surcharge. But the final rates are provided under 115A. So there is no amendment in section 2(9) and the provisos which follow that of the finance bill. So therefore, there is a higher surcharge on the final tax rate. In case of unit holder in a business trust, there is another peculiar problem. Section 194 LBA provides for TDS of 10%, but the final rate will be as per 115A for the non-residents, which is at 20%. Whereas the surcharge, because this is a specific rate, it is not rates in force, so higher surcharge will apply both for TDS purpose as well as for the advance tax for the final rate purposes. The last category is the foreign portfolio investors. For them, there is no mismatch between TDS rate and advance tax rate, but there is no amendment to the surcharge. So therefore, the higher surcharge of 37% will apply for both for TDS as well as for advance tax purposes. We need to see whether the CBDT clarifies whether this was intentional, unintentional, or whether any amendments will be made at when this ordinance which has presently come, when that an amendment act is introduced into the parliament, at that stage whether this anomaly will be rectified or it will be rectified in the next finance bill. The third is about the concessional tax rate for domestic companies. As you all must be aware that domestic companies have an option to either opt for a 22% tax rate under 115 BAA, or newly set up domestic manufacturing companies can avail a tax rate of 15% by sacrificing certain tax incentives and deductions. At the budget proposal stage, an amendment was proposed that first to say that these companies, apart from the income linked deductions under Chapter 6A, they will not be able to claim even non-income linked Chapter 6A deductions. For example, donations to charities under 80G or political parties under 80GGB, 80GGC, etc. And the second was that even if they are not entitled to claim income linked deductions, they can still claim intercorporate dividend deduction under section 80M, which is relevant when we are moving to the classical system of dividend taxation. So this amendment was proposed to be made effective from financial year 1920, assessment year 2021. But at the enactment stage, its effective date has been shifted to assessment year 21-22. So because of that, what has happened is both the amendments has now moved to the assessment year 21-22 or financial year 2021. Now ATM one can understand because ATM deduction will be relevant only under the classical system of dividend taxation. But because the effective date of the amendment has moved, even the amendment related to non-income linked Chapter 6A deductions, that has also moved to the next year. So for the current financial year 1920, such companies who are availing 22% or 15% tax rate can claim deductions under the Chapter 6A, which are payment based, like donations to charities or political parties, etc. And this will be very relevant when we come to the donations to be made, when we come to the ordinance and the donations to be made to the PM Care Fund. Now, availing Chapter 6A deduction in 1920 will not impact their option for financial year 2021. And this is also clarified in the press release accompanying the ordinance. I move to next point, intercorporate dividend taxation, ATM. Now at the budget stage, this ATM deduction, ATM deduction means if a domestic company receives a dividend from another company and it distributes that dividend to its shareholders, then it gets a deduction of that amount so that it does not have to pay tax on that dividend income. So this is basically meant for avoiding the cascading impact of the dividend taxation. Now, at the budget stage, this deduction was restricted only to the dividends received from other domestic companies. At the enactment stage, the scope has been expanded and two more dividends have now been covered. One is the dividends received from foreign company and the other is dividends received from business trust. Now, dividends received from foreign company, there is no further condition. So there is no minimum shareholding required. So if you recollect under 116.15 BBD, there is a 15 concessional rate of 15% tax rate for dividends which are received from foreign companies in which the Indian company holds more than 26% shareholding. But for ATM deduction, there is no such condition. So the Indian company could be a portfolio investor, say holding only about 5% or 10%. The Indian company could be a strategic investor holding between 26 to 50%. It could be a JV holding 50%, or it could be a parent company of the foreign company holding more than 50%. In all the situations, wherever the dividend is received from the foreign company and the Indian company distributes that dividend to its shareholders, it can claim an ATM deduction. The next is about dividends received from business trust. So this we will discuss in the next slide. Now, no amendment is made for dividends which are received from category 1 and category 2 AIF. Now, this may be because of the fiction of the provision, the pass-through provision, by which the incomes received by the fund are treated as having the same character, same nature in the hands of the unit holder, as if the unit holder has made a direct investment into the investee company. So the dividend, if the dividends are received by the fund, these will be treated as dividend income in the hands of the unit holder also. So it is by legal fiction, it is treated as of the same nature. So therefore, the company, if it is a unit holder in a category 1 or category 2 AIF, can claim ATM deduction on such incomes which are deemed to be dividend income. One notable exclusion which has not been covered is income from mutual funds, and more particularly income from equity oriented mutual funds. Now, economically, one will say that income from equity oriented funds should be granted the same status as direct dividends. And this is so for capital gains taxation and other purposes. But it has been a miss. It is the section ATM has not been amended to cover income from equity oriented mutual funds. So ATM deduction will not be available for distribution of dividends out of income from equity oriented mutual funds. I next move to the business trusts or REITs, InvITs, as they are popularly known. Now, at the budget stage, or we'll just understand in two parts, that before the budget, what was the scheme of taxation, and after the budget, what was proposed in the budget, and after the budget, what are the changes. Now, before the amendment, in case of the dividends which are paid by a special purpose vehicle to the business trust. Now, there were two parts. If the business trust is holding 100% in the SPV, then no DDT was applicable. But if the business trust is holding less than 100%, then DDT was applicable. So SPV had to pay DDT. But once SPV had paid the DDT, then there was no further taxation in the hands of the unit holders. So it was exempt in the hands of the unit holders. So when business trust distributed this income to the unit holders, it would be considered as exempt. So there is no TDS required. And at that point of time, no ATM deduction, etc. is not relevant because classical system was not there. At the budget stage, what was proposed was that whatever dividends which are distributed by SPV to the business trust will become taxable in the hands of the unit holders. Now this was, a very radical change, and it had, it was, it would have upset the existing investments which are already made in the many of the REITs, InvITs, etc. by the foreign investors, and it would have also, disturb the plans of the future investments, because if the dividends become taxable, then the return on equity gets diminished. So because therefore the representations were made by the stakeholders, and after at the enactment stage of the finance bill, an amendment was made. Now this amendment is in two parts. Now it will depend upon the dividend taxation in the hands of the unit holder will depend upon whether the SPV, the investee company, is opting for the lower tax rate or it is not opting for the lower tax rate. Suppose the SPV is opting for the lower tax rate, so which is under 115 BAA, which is 22%, effective tax rate of 25.17%, then the dividend income will be taxable in the hands of the unit holders. And the logic perhaps is that because the company is paying a lesser rate of tax, the government will, and if this dividend is made tax free in the hands of the unit holders, so government will lose the revenue. So therefore they have said, if the company is paying a lesser tax, we will collect the tax from the unit holders. So it is going to become taxable in the hands of the unit holders. In the hands of the business trust, there is no impact. This dividend remains exempt. When the business unit distributes this dividend to the unit holders, it has to do a TDS at 10%. And we saw there is a mismatch. The TDS rate is 10%, but in the hands of the non-resident unit holders, the final rate would be 20%. If the unit holder is a company, domestic company, which is eligible for ATM deduction, can it claim the ATM deduction for this dividend? The answer is yes. As we just saw, the ATM scope has been expanded to dividends from business trust. So all this implication will arise if the SPV is opting for 115 BAA. If the SPV does not opt for the lower tax rate, then the dividend income will not be taxed in the hands of the unit holders. The logic being the company is paying full rate of tax. So therefore the government says we don't want further tax from the unit holders. So if the company is not opting, SPV is not opting for the lower tax rate, then the dividend is exempt in the hands of the unit holders. Consequently, if the unit holder is a company, then this dividend income does not form part of the gross total income of the company, and it will not be entitled to ATM deduction. Now, the only problem in this scheme is that there is no exemption from TDS when SPV is paying this dividend to business trust. So business trust will have to do a TDS under 194, and in order to avoid this TDS, the business trust will have to go for a lower TDS certificate. So this is a administrative inconvenience which the business trust will face. Let me move over to the next. Now we have completed the corporate tax rate related amendments. Now we move to the individuals. Now this budget introduced a lower corporate tax rate for the lower tax rates for the individuals and HUFs, just like the corporates, if the individuals are ready to give up certain of the incentives and the deductions. So as per the budget proposal, this option is available every year if the individual HUF is not carrying on any business. But if the individual HUF is carrying on the business, then it's a one-time irrevocable option. So having opted, you cannot come back. But if the business ceases, then you go back to the same as person who is not carrying on business. You will have an year-on-year option available. If you have opted once, you can withdraw once, but having withdrawn, then you cannot again opt in until the business ceases. So this for the business, the individuals HUF carrying on business, the option is an one-time irrevocable option. At the enactment stage, this one-time irrevocable option has been extended to the individuals carrying on profession because they are otherwise at par with the persons carrying on business. Otherwise, a professional could have taken an argument that there is a distinction between business and profession. So even a person carrying on profession could have had an year-on-year option. So this has been addressed at the enactment stage. However, despite the representations, there is no amendment to the finance bill which will expressly permit the employers to consider this lower tax rate for employee salary TDS purposes. Now, all the employees would be interested wherever it is this lower tax rate is beneficial to them without the incentives and the deductions, they would be interested in claiming that benefit. But there is no amendment to the section 2.9, the first proviso to section 2.9 of the finance bill, whereby the employers could have considered this rate, this special rate, for the purpose of salary TDS. So therefore, the employers will need to consider the normal tax regime with incentives and deductions for salary withholding purposes. And if the employees want to claim the lower tax rate, then they can exercise this option at the time of filing of the return of income, because this option is basically for the salaried employees. It has to be exercised. It's an year-on-year option. It has to be exercised while filing of return. One problem which will arise is if the employee is interested in claiming this benefit and he does not give any evidences, etc., of the incentives deductions to the employers, then the employer will have to do even a higher TDS. So suppose 10 lakh rupees is the gross total, the salary income, and the employees do not give any evidences of HRA, etc., which can reduce the taxable income to say 7 lakhs, then employer will have to apply the normal tax on 10 lakhs, which will be much higher than the normal tax on 7 lakhs. So this challenge can arise, and therefore, we are making representations to the government to clarify by way of, at least by way of a circular, that the employers can consider this lower tax rate if the employee is opting for it for salary TDS purposes. Let me go over to the next important amendment where we will spend some more time, the amendment to the residency rule. Now, there are two categories of persons. So first is the inbound, Indian citizens or persons of Indian origin, for whom presently under the, before the amendment, before the budget amendment, the residency rule was that if they stayed in India for more than 182 days, or second was if they have been in India for more than 365 days in the 4 preceding previous years, and in that particular year, if they are in India for more than 182 days, then they will be treated as residents. Otherwise, they will be treated as non-residents. So this in the extended residency rule, the period is 60 days, but for Indian citizens or persons of Indian origin who being outside India come on a visit to India, the 60 days is extended to 182 days. So at the budget stage, it was proposed that this 182 days will be reduced to 120 days. So that will reduce. So therefore, if these the NRIs, if they want to remain non-resident, they will have to restrict their stay in India for less than 120 days. Secondly, there is no deemed residency rule under the old law before the budget amendment, whereby so Indian citizens who are not liable to tax in any other country or territory by reason of their domicile, residence, or any other criteria of a similar nature, they could be deemed to be residents of India. So there was no such deemed residency rule. So they would have become residents only by the residency rules which are provided in section 6. The amendment which was proposed at the budget stage was that these people will be deemed to be residents of India. Now, because of this, there was a lot of apprehensions, more particularly from the Indian diaspora who are settled in Middle East, where there is no income tax. So the apprehension was that whether all these NRIs who are earning foreign incomes would now be required to pay tax in India, because now they are treated as residents of India and they don't pay any tax in the Middle East countries. So immediately the CBDT had to come out with a clarification on 2nd February. The budget was presented on 1st February. On 2nd February, the CBDT came out with a clarification that these changes are more as anti-avoidance rules or anti-abuse rules. It is in order to catch the persons who are dodging the residency by managing their stay. The third part of the so they also, let's say, second part of the clarification was the people who are settled in Middle East countries, there it is not the intention to bona fide workers, it is not the intention to tax their incomes. And the third part was, even if they become resident, it is only their incomes which are, sourced in India, or incomes which are derived from a business or profession controlled from India, only those incomes will be taxed. So at the amendment stage, the clarification which was given through the press release has been brought about, but there is a small change. So let us look at what is now the law, what is the change law at the enactment stage. So if the first category, the Indian citizens or the NRIs who are coming on a visit to India, if they are able to restrict their stay to less than 120 days, then there is no problem. They will continue to be non-residents. Now, if their stay exceeds 120 days, but does not exceed 182 days, now there is another criterion which will kick in, which is the total income criterion. Now, the condition is if their total income other than the foreign source income is less than 15 lakh rupees, then they will continue to be non-residents. They will not be treated as residents. So more than 182 days, more than 120 days, but less than 182 days, and total income other than foreign source income, which basically would mean India sourced incomes, is less than 15 lakhs, then they continue to be non-resident. What if this criteria is not satisfied? More than 120 days and less than 182 days, and the total income other than foreign source income exceeds 15 lakhs, then that person will be treated as a resident, but he is treated as a not ordinarily resident. So he's not treated as a ROR, he is treated as a NOR. Next is the Indian citizens who deemed residency rule. Now that deemed residency rule has also been diluted. Now the condition, just like the for the Indian citizens or PIOs coming on a visit to India, the total income criterion has been put. And if they are not liable to tax in any other country, territory, etc., and their incomes from India is more than 15 lakh rupees, then they will be treated as NOR. Otherwise, they will be either the resident or non-resident as per the normal residency rules. So we can call this, for the sake of convenience, the first category as 120, somebody becoming NOR by 120-day rule, somebody becoming NOR by deemed residency rule. At the budget stage, there was a proposal to relax the NOR rule, because these two categories of people would have become residents. So therefore, in order to provide them some relief, the NOR rule was proposed to be relaxed, that instead of 9 out of 10 years, the condition was relaxed to 7 out of 10 years. Now that proposal has been withdrawn. However, we now have these two new categories of NOR, somebody who qualifies under 120-day rule, somebody who qualifies under deemed residency rule. Now, so long as they fulfill these conditions, they will always be NOR. So if they fulfill these conditions for 10 consecutive years, they'll be treated as NOR for 10 consecutive years. So they have to keep continuing fulfilling these conditions, then they will be treated as NOR. They will not be treated as ordinarily resident. Let us understand what is the implication under the domestic law provisions as also under the treaty provisions. Now, first is, as I said, there is a new criterion of the total income. The total income other than the foreign sourced income should be less than or 15 lakhs in order to, not to trigger this 120-day rule or the deemed residency rule. Or if it is more than 15 days of more than 15 lakh rupees, then you become a NOR. Now, for this purpose, foreign source income is defined to mean income which accrues or arises outside India, except income derived from business controlled or profession set up in India. Now this exception is for the reason that even under the normal NOR rule, if somebody becomes an NOR, his income derived from business controlled or profession set up in India becomes taxable in India. So this is the distinction between the non-resident and a NOR. For non-residents, the foreign sourced incomes are not liable to tax in India unless they are received in India. For NOR, similar rule applies with the exception that income, the foreign income, which is derived from business controlled or profession set up in India, will be taxed in India. So therefore, this exception has been provided. Now the question arises, how do you compute the total income? Because if we go back to computation of total income, you have to go to section 5 and you have to go take the definition of total income as per section 245. So for computing the total income, you need to first find out whether that individual is resident or non-resident or not ordinary resident. And then see where is the income accruing arising or where is the income received. So it is a function of residency as also the place of, the situs of the income. Now, if for determining residency, you have to again go to total income, how will you do it? So this is a, typical chicken and egg controversy, that what will you determine first? The total income you will determine first or the residency you will determine first, because each are dependent on each other. Now that I believe is more of a sort of a technical interpretation problem. Practically, if you see, you have to just see what is the intention is that if the India sourced income is more than 15 lakh rupees, then he becomes an NOR. And for India sourced income, by the concept of total income, it is only the taxable incomes. So you need to consider the taxable incomes from India. So for example, dividend income is now taxable in India. So you have to include that for computing the limit of 15 lakh rupees. That individual may receive other investment incomes like interest from debentures, interest from bank deposits, etc. Now, if those interest income is exempt, like just like NRE interest, NRE deposit interest, etc., is exempt, then it will not enter the total income. But if it is taxable, then it will enter the total income. And the second category is where the incomes are derived from a business controlled or profession set up in India. Now, so far these individuals would have been non-resident. They would have enjoyed the status of non-resident. Now, suppose if you fulfill the 120 days criterion or the deemed residency rule, they become NOR. So what is the implication of that under the domestic law provision? First, as we discussed, the incremental impact as compared to non-residents is that income derived from business controlled in or profession set up in India becomes taxable in India, even if it accrues or arises outside India. Now here, when we are construing, understanding what is the control of business. Now here we have to distinguish between, the control exercised over the company and the control exercised over a proprietary business. In case it's a proprietary business, one can say that there is a control over the business by the proprietor. But if it's if that individual has a substantial shareholding in a company, or he's a sort of a managing director of a foreign company, that does not mean that he has a control over the business of that company. Now, it is a different issue that by virtue of his substantial shareholding or he becoming a director, one will have to now find out whether that foreign company is a resident of India by application of the place of effective management test or the POEM test. But merely having a substantial shareholding in a foreign company or a directorship would not mean that the individual is controlling the business of the foreign company. Now, second, and this is very critical, that there are certain concessional or the flat rates of tax applicable to non-residents under the Domestic Act. So for example, under 115A, 20% tax rate on dividend incomes is applicable to non-residents, or long-term capital gains on unlisted shares at 10% is available to non-residents. Now, if you cease to be non-resident and you become resident but not ordinary resident, so these concessional tax rates will no more be applicable. So here one will then, the individual will now have to rely on the treaty benefit to claim a lower tax rate. So these are the changes, the incremental changes for the persons who convert, their status changes from NR to NOR. What does not change? So there are three aspects. One is foreign asset reporting obligation. So as for non-residents are not required to disclose their foreign assets in the return. Similar exemption is available for NOR. So these NORs who are become NORs by virtue of 120 days rule or the deemed residency rule will not be required to disclose their foreign assets while filing their returns. But like non-residents, they will also have no protection from the Black Money Act if they had failed to report these foreign assets in the past when they were ROR. So if you are ROR, you are required to report your foreign assets. And if you don't report these foreign assets, in future, when these foreign assets are discovered by the tax department, and in that year, even if you are NR or NOR, it will make no difference. The Black Money Act can be invoked against such individual. So this does not change because of the conversion of status from NR to NOR. Second is the income which are deemed to accrue or arise in India will continue to be taxable as per the source rule. So for interest, interest, royalty, fees for technical services, these are deemed to accrue or arise in India. These are taxable in the hands of non-residents. So they will be equally taxable in the hands of the not ordinary residents. Third is there are three sections where non-residents are treated as and not ordinary residents are treated as non-residents in this for the purpose of those three sections. So one is for international TP under section 92 for determining the AE relationship. Second is an anti-avoidance provision of section 93 for avoidance of tax by transfer of income to the non-residents. And the third is for determining the residency of the executors of the estate of a deceased person. So for the purpose of these three sections, the not ordinary resident is also treated as non-resident. So that will continue. So this is what will happen under the domestic law. Now we come to the treaty benefit. So why is the basic question, why is treaty benefit relevant? So under the treaty, India can become either the source country for that individual or India can become the resident country of that individual. If India is source country, then this treaty benefit is relevant for availing the concessional tax rates under the treaty, and these concessional tax rates are available subject to compliance with the treaty anti-abuse provisions. For example, beneficial shareholder condition, or you need to furnish a tax residency certificate, like that. Or now there is a new principal purpose test brought about by the multilateral instrument. If India is a resident country, so India becomes a resident country for that individual, then treaty is relevant for availing the foreign tax credits on the incomes which are arising outside India. But in case of NORs, the only foreign incomes which will be taxable in India are the income which is derived from India controlled business or profession. So on this, if there are any taxes paid in other countries, then under the treaty will be relevant for claiming the foreign tax credits. If an individual is an NOR, very technically, he is not required to furnish a tax residency certificate for availing the treaty benefit, whether as a source country or whether as a resident country, because that condition is there only for a person who is not a resident. So he is a resident, so therefore actually he technically is not required to furnish a TRC to avail the treaty benefit. But practically it is advisable that wherever India is becoming a source country for that individual, then just like non-resident, he should get a TRC to claim the treaty benefit, because he is claiming that he is a resident of the other country. Now, when you come to the treaty benefit, application of the treaty benefit, we can divide it into two classes. So individuals who are tax residents of countries which has a personal tax system like UK, USA, etc. Now they are having a personal taxation. They would be paying taxes in those countries. They would be treated as tax residents of those countries. So when they become NOR of India, and now you have to apply the treaty, if because they are resident of both the countries, so here the dual residency and the tiebreaker test will come into operation. Now one advantage of being a treaty resident of other country is that if you are a resident of other country, tax resident of other country, then the deemed residency rule will not apply, because for application of deemed residency rule, the condition is that you should not be resident of any other country, not be liable to tax in any other country by virtue of your domicile or residence or similar criterion. So if you are a resident of other country, then deemed residency rule will not apply. The next is the more problematic, the circumstance where the individuals are resident in Middle East countries which do not have a personal tax system. So there is a controversy whether, they can be treated as liable to tax in the other country because, there is no personal taxation there. There are judicial precedents which are favoring the taxpayer, which have interpreted the term liable to tax as that individual should be subject to the taxing jurisdiction of the other country. He may not actually pay tax because there is no personal tax levied in that country. So for the treaty purpose, he should still be liable. He should consider as being resident of other country. So this controversy may ignite, and the individuals may have to rely on this, favorable judicial precedents in order to avail the treaty benefit. And this is more particularly for the incomes, as I said, where the concessional tax rates which are available to non-residents, like 20% for dividend incomes, is not available by virtue of being an NOR. Now for UAE and Kuwait, residents of UAE and Kuwait, the treaty residency is based on the number of days of physical presence, not liable to tax. So therefore, it is more easier to fulfill the treaty residency test. So I think the thing should be pretty much clear from this discussion. I deliberately spent some more time on this rule at the special request of Ashok Sharma ji.
Ravikant bhai, just one thing, if you can go to the previous slide.
Yes, please.
Go to the previous slide, sir. Here in the second part, you have mentioned control of business to be distinguished from substantial shareholding or directorship of a foreign company. Actually, technically speaking, probably, no, the same slide. Next slide, next slide.
Yes, please.
The second part, consequential impact of NOR status, you have said control of business should be distinguished from substantial shareholding or directorship of a foreign company. Now, when we talk of individuals, we need not see if there is a company, a poem will be applicable, and if it is a residence as per poem, fine. Otherwise, if an individual is holding either shareholding or directorship, we need not consider. It is only in case he has a proprietorship business in some other country, and if that business is controlled from India or that profession is set up in India, then only probably it should trigger this particular two clauses which have been added during the current year.
Now, exactly, you have made the same point which I was trying to explain, that control of business should not be confused with the substantial shareholding. Merely because somebody is having a more than say 90% shareholding in a foreign company, one cannot say that he is controlling the business of the foreign company.
Even if he is controlling, poem is a separate thing.
Yes.
It will that particular test is not to be applied for these two particular clauses which have been introduced recently.
That's right. That you are very right.
Correct, sir?
Yeah, yes,
but
yes,
that's all.
Yeah,
that's all.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'll now move over to the next TDS and TCS provisions. Now, one good thing about TDS and TCS was the provisions were to kicking on 1st of April 2020. So dates have been deferred for the TCS and 194 OTDS, which was proposed in the budget from 1st of April to 1st of October. But at the enactment stage, for the TDS on cash withdrawals, there is a change. Now, this TDS on cash withdrawals was brought in last year, and it said that if the cash withdrawals are more than 1 crore from more than one or more bank accounts, then there will be a TDS at the rate of 2%. And this provision came in from 1st of September 2019. At budget stage, there was no proposal to amend this TDS provision, but at the stage of enactment, there is an amendment made in with regard to a particular category of persons whom we can call non-filers. So these non-filers are the persons who have failed to file returns for 3 successive years, for which the time limit under 139(1) has already expired immediately before the year of cash withdrawal. So for these category of people who are not filing the returns, now the TDS rules are made more strict. So the TDS will apply at 2% on the cash withdrawals. The TDS threshold of 1 crore has been reduced to 20 lakhs for these category of persons who are non-filers. And if their cash withdrawal exceeds 1 crore, then there will be a TDS of 5%. Now, because of this very peculiar condition that failure to file returns for 3 successive years, for which time limit under 139(1) has expired, and immediately preceding the year of cash withdrawal. Now, operationally, one will find some difficulty of applying this condition because the due dates are different for different types of taxpayers. So 31st July for individuals, non-corporate, 31st October now, after the amendment, budget amendment for the, people who are liable to tax audit, 30th November for TP cases. Now, this 3-year period could be different for the different, classes of taxpayers, and the TDS provision would be different for cash withdrawals which are made before and after the due date, for during each year of cash withdrawal. So take for example, for an individual whose due date is 31st of July 2020. So for finding out whether the TDS would apply with a higher threshold or a lower threshold or a higher rate, the return filing compliance will need to be seen for 3 financial years immediately preceding this 2021, for which the due date has already expired. So 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19. Now 18, 19, actually the due date has been extended, but I'm just giving an example. For this, the due dates have already expired. So then we have to see, the bank has to see whether the returns have been filed for any of these 3 years. If the return is filed for any one of these 3 years, then the condition is not attracted. So they are not non-filers. So they will come under the regular TDS threshold. But if they have not filed returns for all the 3 years, not even a belated return. So belated return is also a return, valid return. But if they have not even filed a belated return, then the stricter norms will apply. Now, after 31st of July, then 1 year goes by. So now the years change. The rolling period will be now be the 3 years that will need to be looked at is 17, 18, 18, 19, and 19, 20. For 19, 20, the due date 31st July 20 has already expired. Now, this is my reading of the provision based on, how the language presently stands. There could be, different view, or the CBDT may need to clarify, because this will create a lot of challenges for the banks to find out, what are the, which are the 3 years they need to consider for the purpose of testing this condition. For other people who are not, fulfilling this condition, the TDS rate continues to be 2%, threshold of 1 crore continues to apply. But now the entire section has been substituted, and there is a slight change in the language of the substituted provision, because of which there is an ambiguity. The confusion being that if the withdrawal crosses 1 crore, whether TDS is to be applied only on the excess over 1 crore or in the entire amount, including the earlier amount 1 crore. So there has to be a catch-up TDS. Now, under the old provision before the amendment, it was very clear, it was only on the excess. But now, after the change in the language, there is some amount of confusion, which the CBDT will need to clarify. The third change is that the central government already has the power to notify the exceptions where this provision will not apply. For example, there is a list of, they have by notification, they have exempted agents of white label ATM operators. Now, apart from nil TDS cases, they can now also specify lower TDS cases for the purpose of this section. So where instead of 2%, 1% can apply, like that. So these are the changes for the cash withdrawals. I now move over to the TDS or TCS on the LRS, the liberalized remittance scheme, and the sale of goods. Here have also been extended to the 1st of October. So there's a 6 months time limit available in order to implement the provision. As per the budget proposal, there is a 5% TCS on both the LRS remittance as also on the overseas tour program package. For LRS remittance, there is a threshold of 7 lakhs. For overseas tour package, there is no threshold. Now, there was a confusion that the limit of LRS limit includes the remittance for the overseas package. So whether there will be a duplicated LRS. So that is been now clarified. Second part was that if the LRS is out of an education loan, then also it was suffering a very high TDS of TCS of 5%. So that is now also clarified. Now there are 4 provisos which have been added. So we'll just see what those are. So first proviso says that if the remittance is for other than overseas tour package, which is less than, and it is less than 7 lakhs, then there will be no TCS. Second category, if the remittances are other than for overseas tour package exceeding 7 lakhs, then TCS will be on 5%, but only on the amount exceeding 7 lakh rupees. If the remittance is out of some education loan, which is borrowed from a specified financial institution defined in ATE, which entitles the payer to have claim the interest deduction, then the TCS will be at lower rate of 0.5% instead of the 5% on remittances exceeding 7 lakh rupees. And if the TCS is already collected by the seller of the tour package, overseas tour package, then there will be no TCS by the authorized dealer or the bank. So for these purposes, the bank will need to examine whether the TCS has been done by the tour package operator. The second part is about the TCS on sale of goods. Now here there was a big apprehension about TCS on sale of goods becoming applicable on export and import of goods also. So whether the foreign sellers of the goods or the Indian sellers of the goods when they are exporting, or the foreign sellers when they are exporting to India, whether they will be also be covered by the sale of goods on TCS on sale of goods. So that has been clarified by excluding them at the stage of enactment. However, there was a representation that the goods are not defined. So goods should be defined properly so as to what it includes and what it excludes. So that definition has not come. So there is still some ambiguity about whether these goods will include shares, securities, or foreign currency, actionable claims, etc. Which definition one relies on, sale of goods, GST definition, etc., etc. So such controversies will now continue. So I come to the end of the first part. I have taken a lot of time in first part. So let me quickly, while all the queries which I have raised, let me try to cover it up at the end of the session. I'll continue the my discussion. The second part of the discussion is on the statutory compliances, etc., which would have been very difficult to make during this disruption, during this lockdown period due to this COVID-19 pandemic. So on 24th of March, the finance minister announced certain relaxations on the compliances part, and to implement those announcements, an ordinance was issued on 31st of March. So this ordinance comprises of 8 sections. First 5 sections are pertaining to the direct taxes, and the next 3 sections are pertaining to the indirect taxes, and they are basically to implement the reliefs which are already announced on 24th of March 2020. Now, for the purpose of direct tax, the term defined is specified act, and which covers all the family of direct tax laws, whether it is wealth tax, income tax, Benami property, security transaction, commodity transaction, Black Money Act, equalization levy, or direct tax Vivad se Vishwas scheme. So all of them have been clubbed together and defined together as a specified act. Now, section 3 is the operative section, which grants the relief from compliances. So for this purpose, the first is what is a period of disruption. So 20th March 2020, so after which the lockdowns etc. were announced, to 29 June 2020 is defined as, or not really defined, it is the period of disruption which you can consider, but this period can also be extended by a notification by the government. So any compliances which were due to be made between this period 20th March to 29 June will stand extended. Up to what date? That date is 30th of June 2020, or it can be any other date which the central government can notify, because unfortunately if the lockdown has to be extended, the disruption extends for a longer period, then the central government can notify an extended date for making such compliances, and different dates can be notified for different actions. Now, what are the reliefs? That reliefs can be, categorized into 4 buckets. The first is which are, tax authority centric. Wherever the tax authority had to complete any assessment proceedings or order, notice, intimation, notification, sanction, approval by any tax authority or settlement commission or the tribunal between these two dates, 20th March to 29 June, it can do till 30th of June. Next bucket is taxpayer or tax authority as the context may require. So it could be for filing of appeal, replies, application, reports, documents, returns. So here returns, the press release is clarifying it will include the revised return as well as belated returns for financial year 18-19, which was due on 31st of March 2020. And the press release also refers to the Aadhaar PAN linking date, which was 31st of March 2020. All those stand extended to 30th of June. Third category is for the taxpayer centric. Wherever the taxpayer had to make any investment, deposit, payment, or construction, etc., for claiming the capital gains rollover relief under section 54 to 54 GB or chapter 6A under the heading deductions in respect of payment, like ATC for LIC, NSC, provident fund, etc., ATCCD for new pension scheme, ATD for medical premium, ATG for donation, etc. Any such deductions which is falling under the chapter 6A B, that this date stands extended up to 30th of June 2020. Now, after these, besides these two provisions, the central government has also retained the power to notify any other provision. So now the for business chapter or house property chapter, etc., if the taxpayers are facing difficulties, representations can be made to the government, and the government can notify other provisions also, where the date can be extended up to 30th of June or a further date. The fourth was, which was not covered in the press release, that the sunset date for setting up of the SEZ unit, which was expiring for claiming 10AA benefit. It was expiring on 31st of March 2020. It has been extended up to 30th of June, but the condition is that the SEZ unit should have received a letter of approval from the SEZ authority on or before 31st of March 2020. Now here one problem or a interpretational issue which arises is, if they do it, if they set up the unit by 30th of June, which which will be the first year of tax holiday for such units, whether it will be financial year 1920 because this relaxation is given for 1920, or because they have opened in 2021, the 2021 will be considered the first year. So this will need to be debated, deliberated or clarified by the government. The next aspect is about payment of taxes. For payment of taxes, the important point is there is no extension, because the government is facing, the shortage of revenues. The tax revenues have not been reached even the budgeted level. So therefore, they have not extended the date for payment of any tax or levy which was falling due between the specified period. But the relaxation which has been offered is, if they are paid by 30th of June or by the further notified date, there will be two reliefs. One is the rate of interest for the period of delay will not exceed 7.75% or 9% instead of the normal rate of 8% as the case. But the condition is it should be paid by 30th of June. It should become due between the specified period. So if the default has already been committed prior to the specified period, prior to 20th of March, then there is no such relief. And secondly, if it is paid beyond 30th of June, then there is no relief. So it is only for the limited period which was due between the specified period. The second relief is there will be no penalty or no prosecution for the period of delay. Again, subject to the same conditions which I discussed. You have to pay it before 30th of June. However, there is no clarity on the coercive, whether the department will take coercive measures to recover outstanding tax demands where there is no stay. Where stay has been granted and stays have been extended by the courts, there is no problem. But where there has been no stay, so whether the department can still take a coercive measures to recover outstanding tax demand, that is not clear from the ordinance. The next part is about the PM Care Fund. Now, PM Care Fund was recently, set up by the government for addressing the emergency situations like COVID-19. So the press release said that it is eligible, donations are eligible for ATG deduction. It was not clarifying whether it is 100% or 50%. So now that has been addressed by including the ordinance, and it has been given the same status as the PM National Relief Fund. So it will be exempt on its income at 100% exemption. Plus for the donors, there will be 100% deduction without the cap of 10% of GTI, just like PM National Relief Fund. Now, because of the extension of the due date, as we just saw a little while ago, so even for the financial year 1920, if the donations are made till 30th of June 2020, or if a further date is notified till that date, then it can be claimed in 1920 itself. So there is an extended date available for claiming in 1920. Now the question you will ask is that if I make a donation by 30th of June, will it be mandatorily considered for 1920? Which I personally believe is no. There will be I believe there is an option for the taxpayer. Either he claims in 1920, or if he wants to claim in 2021, he will have to claim, he can claim in 2021, provided he is not going for the lower tax rate without deductions in the subsequent year. Now, in case of salary TDS for employees, there was a past circular number 2 of 2005, which permitted a consolidated payment by the employer for donation by the employees, and the donation receipt could be issued by the employer, for the three funds, which is PM National Relief Fund, CM Relief Fund, and the Lieutenant Governor's Relief Fund. Now, this circular is not yet modified, so it is doubtful, whether the employers can, do the same procedure for even the PM Care Fund. The difficulty there is, if employer makes one consolidated contribution to the fund, and which is now an online contribution, then the receipt will come in the name of the employer. So therefore, further clarity is required if this circular is amended. The next part is for the domestic companies who are claiming, the lower tax rates for 1920. Now they also have an opportunity because the effective date of the amendment, as we discussed, has been moved to 2021. So if they make donations to this PM Care Fund by 30th of June, they can still claim the benefit in 1920, and this will not impact their lower tax rate for the next year, 2021. The last part is about Vivad Se Vishwas scheme. So the time limit, 31st March 2020 was the time for availing full benefit without incurring the 10% additional tax. That has been extended from 31st March to 30th of June. So next part is about, this is the ordinance related. The next part is the CBDT has come out with 3 orders pertaining to the lower TDS. So the first order was issued on 31st of March 2020 for dealing with the lower TDS applications for financial year 2021. So difficulty is known to everyone that even the taxpayers are unable to access the traces portal for making the applications. And even if the applications have been made, the income tax officers are unable to attend office and process those applications. So because of these reasons, and in between if the tax is to be deducted, so difficulties will be faced by taxpayers. So therefore a relaxation has been offered. So for the lower TDS certificates for 2021, the relief is given in 4 buckets. So 4 circumstances are covered. The first circumstance is if there is already a certificate for 1920 and the taxpayer, the payee, has applied for a similar certificate for 2021 on the traces portal, then the deductor can take into account the certificate for 1920. It will continue to apply till 30th of June, or disposal of application by the AO, whichever is earlier. So now this certificate for 1920, my personal reading is that it will now amount to sort of a fresh provisional certificate. So if 1 crore was the limit given in the 1920, so 1 crore limit will start again, even if the 1 crore was fully consumed in 1920. For 2021, again this 1 crore will, fresh limit will apply. So it is just a temporary relief because the application cannot be disposed by the tax department. So therefore it is just like a temporary provisional certificate, we can call it. So this is a circumstance where there is already a certificate available and application is already made. So next condition is, what if application is not made though certificate is available for 1928? Now ordinarily the application has to be made by traces portal, but if the taxpayer is facing difficulty to access the traces portal, so and department will also not be able to process those applications, so therefore the relief which is applied is, yes, certificate for 1920 will continue to apply, but the application will need to be made over email, and the date by which it has to be made is at the earliest as soon as normalcy is restored, or 30th of June 2020, whichever is earlier. So the relaxation is that instead of traces portal, you can give all the information which you normally give on the traces portal, form number 13 and all the accompanying documents, that you can send by email to the concerned AO. The date, now that is little ambiguous, by which date you should be giving this certificate, making this application. It is said as soon as the normalcy is restored, or 30th June 2020, whichever is earlier, at the earliest. So now suppose the normalcy is restored on 15th of April. So whether the application has to be made by 15th of April, and if you fail to make it by 15th of April, whether this benefit will not be available, is little ambiguous. So this interpretation of at the earliest or as soon as normalcy is restored is little ambiguous, not very clear. Nevertheless, there is a relief that you can make an application by email. Third is if 1 and 2 is not applicable, so it's a fresh application for for 2021, then ordinarily you have to apply by traces portal. The relief offered is that you can make an application over email, but until such application is disposed of by email, then the lower TDS benefit cannot be given by the deductor, because this is a fresh application. There is no precedent for 1920. The last category is where the payments are to be made to non-residents having a P in India. Now, if they have a P in India, they are liable to net basis of taxation. Tax rate will be 40% if it is a company, 30% if it's not a company. So therefore, very high tax rate will apply if there is no relief, and there is no similar certificate for 1920. So for such kind of payments, the relief which is provided is that the payer can deduct tax at 10%, which includes the surcharge and cess, till 30th of June 2020, or disposal of the application, whichever is earlier. So this is a specific benefit for given for payments to NRs not having P in India. Now this relief, though it is well intended, there are certain operational challenges. For example, the banks are asking the question whether we should be collecting the proof of this application being made by the payee for giving the benefit. A very strict reading of the instruction would mean that you have to fulfill both the conditions, that there is a certificate, so this is available with the bank, but what about the current application? So that evidence is also to be furnished, then only the benefit can be given. So this difficulty is being faced by a lot of deductors, especially the banks. The next is about the application spending for 1920 and for 15G 15H. Now for 1920, if the applications are already made and they have not been disposed, what the CBDT has said is that whoever has made a timely application through the Traces portal and they have raised the invoices, but they have not received the payment. Normally, like invoices are raised for 31st of March and the due date for TDS is 30th of April. Now for in those cases, if the lower TDS is not intimated, then the deductor will apply deduct tax at a higher rate. So in those cases, the taxpayers can intimate to the AO over the email about the pending applications along with the required documents and evidences of the application filed in the Traces portal, and the AO will dispose such application by 27th April 2020 by email and communicate it to the taxpayer, who has to in turn share it with the deductor and the collector. So by 30th of April, if you have the certificate, then you can give the benefit of lower TDS. But this lower TDS certificate will be applicable if it is disposed by 27th April for the amount which is credited or debited during 1920 after the date of making application, but remaining unpaid till the date of issuance of certificate by the AO. So it will not apply for the payments or the credits which are made prior to the date of making application. The last part is about 15G 15H. So all the the individuals, senior citizens, etc., where normally the practice is that in the month of April you go to the banks and give 15G 15H for not deducting tax. Now that because of this COVID disruption cannot be made, so there is a relief which is offered through another order dated 30th of April 2020, that if the valid form 15G 15H has been furnished for 1920, it will continue to be valid up to 30th of June for the financial year 2021. But the deductors will the payers will need to report that in their quarterly TDS statement for 30th of June 2020, which in any case they would have done if the 15G 15H was furnished even on time. So they would have to report these payments. Now, what if you don't submit a form, the certificate 15G 15H by 30th of June 2020? My personal reading is that if there is a valid 15G 15H for 1920 which has been submitted, the bank can consider that till 30th of June, and any TDS which is to be done after 30th of June, then it can apply the higher TDS. So the relaxation is that this certificate will be valid. The last year's 15G will be valid till 30th of June. So the banks can consider those forms. So this brings me to the end of the second part. And what I see is that time is only about 15 minutes is left, where I need to cover the equalization levy and the TDS on e-commerce transactions. So let me try to complete, just to the purpose of this discussion will be to just to get what is the basic points or the important points which have come out of this e-commerce, the equalization levy, because this equalization levy has come at the enactment stage, so there is no explanatory memorandum, etc. In order to understand, there was no prior consultation, so it has come all of a sudden. So we need to understand, at least for the purpose of today's discussion, what are the basic ingredients, key points of this levy. Maybe further, after we have read the provision, there will be some further points, and for which a dedicated sort of a session will be required to discuss those points in detail. Now, before we go, a small background of the taxation of the digital economy has always posed problems for all the countries. So BEPS report was there, action plan was there, where they had suggested that there could be three alternatives: either you have a significant economic presence, or there could be a withholding tax, or there could be an equalization levy. But it all should all be subject to the existing treaty. Now, these digital businesses face problems of taxation because the countries are unable to tax under the conventional, the PE rule, etc. Because these businesses, they can increase their scale without having any physical presence in the, except for example in India. So they don't need to have any physical presence in India, but they can do business with India and earn considerable amounts of revenue. There is no tangible assets, though they rely more on software, apps, etc., and they earn their income. And the value comes more from the data or the number of users. So that becomes their value driver, but it is not possible to tax them under the conventional rule. So therefore, there should be certain alternatives. So the entire globe is trying to move towards a consensus, and deliberations are being made. Different alternatives are being debated. India has also been, trying one way or the other. In 2016, an equalization levy was first introduced on online advertisements, which are paid by a resident or a non-resident having a P in India to a non-resident. Then the payer, it is a payer-based levy where the payer will deduct 6%, is a 6% and pay it to the government. And because it is not levied under the Income Tax Act, it is levied under a Finance Act, separate Finance Act 2016. So there are difficulties of the non-resident getting a credit in their home country because it is not covered under the treaty. So it becomes an additional cost. Now, the India was waiting for a consensus to build up, and if there is a consensus, then all the countries can levy tax on a uniform basis. Unfortunately, the deliberations are going on. There is a tug of war between the developed and the developing countries, and the uniform solution is not being reached. So in between, India has been trying to expand its source rules to have a better bargaining position at the treaty negotiation stage. But this year, the policy, imperatives forced the government to introduce this equalization levy, and that too at the enactment stage. At the budget stage, what we had seen that there was some amendment to the source rule for the income attribution in case of the business connection to cover the income from sale of advertisement targeted to the Indian users, or the sale of data collected from Indian users, or sale of goods or provision of services using the data collected from Indian users. So that was one proposal which had come in the current year's budget. Second was the TDS under 194O on the e-commerce operators who are making payment to the resident sellers. So that date was to come from 1st April, but it has now been deferred to 1st October. The third was the significant economic presence, which was introduced in 2018. The date has been shifted to 2021. But as I said, these are like the amendments in the domestic rules, unless the treaties are also amended on similar lines. So these are not insufficient to tax the non-residents. So therefore, the problems which the government faced was that because of this COVID-19, there is no immediate solution in sight for the digital activity taxation, and the government is falling short of the revenues. So where does the government bring new sources of revenues? It has already given out the concessional tax rates to the corporates, concessional tax rates to the individuals, etc. So where does this bring the new source of revenue? So therefore, as a policy decision taken at the very last minute, an equalization levy was introduced at the enactment stage, and it is becoming applicable from 1st of April 2020 onwards. Now, for TDS on e-commerce transactions, we had discussed this at the budget study circle. So basically, the obligation is on the e-commerce operator. The e-commerce operator can be a resident or a non-resident. And in case of a non-resident, that section 2045 subclause 5 has been inserted to include a person who is responsible to pay, including the authorized person, agent, or a person who is treated as an agent of the representative SSC of the e-commerce operator. An e-commerce operator is defined to mean a person who owns, operates, or manages the digital or electronic facility or platform for e-commerce. At the budget stage, there is a second part to this definition. That is, that person should also be responsible for making payment to the resident e-commerce participant. Now, at the enactment stage, this part of the definition has been omitted, and there is a deeming fiction which has been brought that e-commerce operator shall be deemed to be a person responsible for making payment to an e-commerce participant. So even if he is not actually paying anything to the e-commerce participant, he is deemed to be the person responsible. So he will be responsible for TDS. So this has caused a lot of concern for the e-commerce operators who are just providing some listing services, who don't have much involvement with the actual cash flows between the seller and the buyer. Now, the TDS is applicable on the sale of goods or provision of services of an e-commerce participant if it is facilitated by the e-commerce operator. So the e-commerce operator only plays the role of sort of an agent. He facilitates the bringing together of the seller and the buyer. He himself is not the seller or the buyer in such kind of transactions. Now here, because there could be difficulties, etc., the CBDT at the enactment stage, a change has been made where CBDT can prescribe the guidelines for removing the difficulties. Such guidelines will be laid before both the houses of parliament, and such guidelines will be binding on both the tax authority and the e-commerce operator. So this is added at the enactment stage. Now, in relation to TDS, the rate is 1%. It is on the gross amount of sales or services. That means whatever is collected by the e-commerce operator and paid over, let's say 100 rupees is collected from the customer, paid over to the seller, and 100 it is paid to the seller after deducting the operator's own commission. Still, the TDS has to be on the gross amount. Now, even where the payment is made by the customer directly to the seller, e-commerce participant, it is deemed to be credited or paid by the e-commerce operator, and the e-commerce operator is made liable to deduct tax thereon. Now, this levy is in the nature of a withholding tax. So therefore, the e-commerce participant can claim that credit while filing a return of income against his final tax liability. The persons who are covered, who will be subject to this TDS, it is a e-commerce participant who is a resident in India. So it should be, it's a domestic, basically it's a domestic withholding. There is an exception carved out for e-commerce participant who are individuals or HUF, where the gross amount of such sales or service is less than 5 lakh rupees, and such individual or HUF has furnished a PAN or Aadhaar to the e-commerce operator. Once this TDS is made or the case is covered by this exception, then that payment will not be subject to any other TDS. So even if it is otherwise, if it was made directly by the customer to the the service provider, and if TDS, it would have been a contract, so it would have attracted 2%. But if it is made through the e-commerce operator and the e-commerce operator deducts say 1% while making payment to the service provider, then the 194C will not apply. The only TDS that will apply is the TDS on which the receipts by the e-commerce operator himself from the participant for hosting the advertisement, for the advertisement or listing fees, etc., which he collects from the seller himself. So in that case, the seller has to deduct the TDS. Otherwise, the customers are relieved from the TDS obligation. So this is broadly the scheme of the TDS provision. Now we quickly see what was the existing equalization levy. So existing equalization levy had come in from 1st of June 2016. It is payable by a person who is resident in India, carrying on business or profession. So therefore it applies only to B2B transactions, not for B2C transaction. It is applicable also for a non-resident who is having a P in India when he is making payment to the non-resident who is providing the specified service. And the exceptions are if the recipient NR who is providing the specified service has a P in India and that specified service is effectively connected with such P. The logic being that if he has a P in India, then he is in any case liable to pay tax in India on his income. So therefore, this equalization levy is not required. The second is the de minimis threshold. The threshold was aggregate consideration receivable by the NR for specified service does not exceed 1 lakh rupee in a financial year. So if for each payer, he can say up to 1 lakh, he does not need to pay any equalization levy. If the payment exceeds 1 lakh, then he has to pay the equalization levy. And if the payment is not for the purpose of carrying out business or profession. So B2C transactions are not covered by equalization levy. Only B2B transactions are covered by equalization levy for this online advertisement TL. The rate is 6% and the specified service is the online advertisement, any provision for digital advertising space or any other facility, etc., and any other service which may be notified by the central government. But from 2016, the central government has not expanded on this list, so no other services were notified. And now suddenly we find that now there is a new equalization levy. So this is the scheme of the existing equalization levy where there is already a 6% TL on online advertisement services. How does now this new e-commerce EL operate? Now this has been brought in at from 1st of April 2020 itself. So it is very short notice, 1 week's notice. It has been brought. So it has already triggered. The act is already passed. Now, unlike advertisement based EL, where the payer is supposed to deduct, this is based tax, where the payee, non-resident payee recipient has to pay the tax. So the obligation is on the non-resident e-commerce operator who is not having a P in India, and his sales turnover or gross receipts is more than 2 crore rupees, and he is not covered under the existing online advertisement EL. Here, same, the e-commerce operator is defined in the same manner as for 194.0, but here it is more specified that it is only a non-resident. So resident e-commerce operators are not covered by the e-commerce EL, because residents will always, pay their taxes on their incomes in India. So therefore, it is the equalization levy does not extend to them. So they should, the e-commerce operator either owns, operates, or manages a platform, digital or electronic platform. The scope, what is the nature of service which is covered? It is e-commerce supply or services made or provided or facilitated by it. So it covers 4 types of services where the e-commerce operator himself sells the goods, which makes a sale of goods. There is an online sale of goods which are owned by the e-commerce operator. So that is covered. If the e-commerce operator himself provides services, so online provision of services by the e-commerce operator. So both these transactions, which you can call as a proprietary transactions. The third is those transactions which are facilitated by the e-commerce operator. He is himself not selling or providing service, but is facilitating the sale by some other seller or a service provider. So that limb is covered. And the fourth is any combination of these 3 activities. For this purpose, online. So online is already defined in the existing EL, which means the facility or service or right or benefit or access that is obtained through internet or any other form of digital or telecommunication network. So in online sale of goods is covered, online provision of services is covered. So online facilitation is covered. Now the question will arise whether online means what, whether all the facets of the transaction has to be online, or even if some part is online, it will still, qualify, get covered within the scope. Now, there is no clear answer to this, because in many cases, what can happen, especially for sale of goods, the contract is entered online, but the delivery of the goods is taken physically. So there is no online involved. So there is no digital technology involved. The goods are delivered physically, but yet it may get covered within the wide scope. Similarly, for provision of services, there could be certain online services where you digitally download some new software, gaming software, etc., or where there could be the services like hotels or rooms, etc., where you book the rooms by sitting in India, but you enjoy the facility after going to that foreign country. So there is no clarity, presently, as this, if you read it very literally, everything is covered. The rate of EL is 2%, and it is not in the nature of income tax. So therefore, there could be some problem, just as in case of advertisement EL, there could be some problems in claiming the credit. The persons who are covered, like who are the persons who are making payment? The person making payment, or rather the making payment, it is to whom the services are provided. So if the services are provided, provided or facilitated to 3 categories of persons: a person's resident in India, regardless of what is whatever the purpose may be, whatever the nature of services or goods may be; a non-resident, that is sale by one non-resident, the operator is non-resident and the consumer is also non-resident, but only for 2 categories of transactions. For a non-resident will be covered only for the, as the consumer of the service, it will be only 2 categories of transactions are covered. First is the sale of advertisement targeted at a customer who is resident in India, or accessing such advertisement through an Indian IP address. Second is the sale of data collected from a person resident in India, or from a person who uses an Indian IP address. So basically what they have tried to cover up here is that if, say, one non-resident is, say, making payment to another non-resident for making a targeted advertisement which are targeted for the customers in India, then that has got a nexus in India, and therefore it is brought within the scope of equalization levy. Or one non-resident is selling a data pertaining to the Indian persons, Indian customers, then that has got an access with the India, and therefore it has to be brought within the equalization levy. The third category is a person who buys the goods or services both using an Indian internet protocol address. So this is very, very, very ambiguous. Or you may, it is based on a very technical term, that is, if you are using an Indian IP address, then you will be covered as a consumer, you will be covered within equalization levy. The obligation is on the non-resident e-commerce operator. Where it will not apply? So if the non-resident e-commerce operator has got a P in India, and these services are effectively connected, the logic being that he is already liable to tax in India. So therefore, he need not be subjected to equalization levy. If the service is already covered by the 6% EL, then there is no sense in going to 2%. So therefore, it will not be covered within this 2% e-commerce EL. It will still remain within the 6% EL. And the third is the threshold of the turnover. If it is turnover is less than 2 crores during that particular financial year, then this EL will not apply. Corresponding exemption under the Income Tax Act, just like for advertisement EL, once the non-resident, the service is covered by EL, then the same service will not be taxed again. Same income will not be taxed again under the income tax. So there is an exemption which is provided in 1050. So that is being amended to cover even the new 2% EL for e-commerce transactions, and the conditions being that the income should arise from services covered within the scope of EL, and the EL should be chargeable on such services. However, this exemption is made applicable from 1st April 2021, but the EL has triggered in from 1st April 2020. So for 1 year, there is a apprehension that there can be a double taxation of both EL, and if the service is liable to tax under the income tax, so both taxes can apply. There are many contentious issues. I think we are running short of time. Many aspects are not clear. So let me take up, some 2 or 3 key issues. So first is that, the consideration, determining the consideration. So suppose there is a facilitation, the e-commerce operator is just facilitating the transaction. That time he collects 100 rupees from the customer, and that he has to pay 80 rupees to the seller, and he retains his commission of 20 rupees, which is his own income as a facilitation fee. Now there is no clarity whether this EL will apply on the gross amount of 100 or only the net amount of income. It says consideration which is received by the e-commerce operator, and which is consideration which is received for the sales made or services provided or facilitated. So there is no clarity whether it is on the gross amount or on the net amount. Secondly, now what about this? The policy intent is to cover the transactions which were hitherto not covered within the income tax. This government is looking at this EL as a new source of revenue. So suppose the services were already covered within the scope of income tax, just like royalty or fees for technical services, but they are now provided through the e-commerce operator. Whether now they will be taxable at a lower rate of 2% instead of the normal rate of 10%. And this is again a very big question. The government intent clearly is that it is a new source of revenue, so they will not, the intent is not to reduce the tax on the existing services, but because of the wide scope of the language, this particular aspect is still not very clear. Third is the mismatch in the date of the charging provision, which is kicked in from 1st April 2020, whereas the exemption is from 1st April 2021. So this also mismatch needs to be addressed. Next is the EL and the TDS, under 194O, both can apply to a non-resident e-commerce operator if the seller is a resident, if the participant is a resident. So say for example, if the seller is a resident and that sale has been facilitated by a non-resident e-commerce operator who does not have a PE in India, and if 100 rupees is collected by it and he pays 80 rupees to the seller, then the e-commerce operator will have to pay EL. Now on EL has to be paid whether on 100 or only on 20, that is a debatable issue. Plus he has to also do the 194O TDS of 1% on the gross amount, which is of rupees 100. So there are many issues, and we are the discussions with the government, because the government had also no time to make any consultation with the stakeholders before introducing this provision. So there are a lot of questions. If we read it literally, the scope is very wide to include each and every service which has got some digital connect to those goods or service. Even the traditional businesses, traditional sales, etc., might get covered. So we need to debate with the government, and government will need to come out with some clarifications. On the compliances part, the non-resident e-commerce operator will need to take a tax registration, and the immediate compliance date is 7th of July, because this taxes EL has to be paid on a quarterly basis. So for 30th of June it has to be paid by 7th of July. So this would be the immediate concern, ki by 7th of July all the non-resident e-commerce operators have to pay TDS. So unless paid this equalization levy, so unless there is sufficient clarity on what are the types of services which are covered, on what amount is the EL is to be paid, etc., they will find it difficult and more challenging, because now you have a COVID-19 disruption across the globe. There is a, just like the current advertisement EL, there is an annual statement to be filed, but all these compliances, the main difference is it has to be done by the non-resident, but not by the resident payer. So it has to be done by the non-resident payee, who may not have otherwise any taxable presence in India. There is interest, there is penalty, there is prosecution in case of furnishing false statement. And the other, the very important thing is the representative SSC part, that the provisions of the Income Tax Act have been also been borrowed for the purpose of EL. So one limb which has been borrowed is that if the representative SSC, who is the payer of the income, can also be charged if the non-resident e-commerce operator fails to discharge the liability. So the payer may also get obligated to pay this EL, just like in case of a TDS default in case of payment to a non-resident. So I have, on the rest of the slides, I have just tried to compare the features of this online advertisement, etc. So I will not take you through all these slides. I think I have already run out of this time. So at the end, I have also given certain case studies which you can go through at your convenience. So I come to the end of this presentation. I'm sorry I exceeded the time limit a bit. I'm not sure whether we'll have some time for answering the queries. Yes, Sharma ji, please.
Sharma ji, means if you are prepared, Ravikant bhai, then there are few questions. Questions are many as such. We have received 57 questions.
Okay, so it may not be possible. Yeah, but you can just, I'll also try to see.
So there are, you like to answer few of any, if you think?
Yeah, so 5 minutes can I spend on trying to answer each query?
Yeah,
Yes,
if you
please.
find, yes.
Yeah,
That will be very nice of you, because there are, for your information, there are more than 400 attendees. There's been an excellent response.
Yeah.
And this, Mr. Ravikant ji, when we had your budget on the finance bill in February, we had received a very good feedback from our members who had attended. And this is the result of this, Mr. Ravikant. And today's session was also very nice. We all will be very happy if you can extend some time for the question answers. Will be for the benefit of all the participants.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
sure,
so you can take up the questions.
Yeah, I'll take some of the questions.
Please, yeah.
So one question is, when can we expect the clarifications on EL from the government? That is a $1 million question. As we are finding it difficult to go to the office, the department officials are also finding, the CBDT officials are also finding it difficult to attend the offices and have meetings. But definitely there will be some clarifications before the 7th of June, because the government is also very conscious. We had some informal discussions with the CBDT official, and he has also appreciated the problems, the wide scope, and the ambiguity around consideration, possible tax avoidance, etc. So they are seized of the issue. So we should be expecting some clarifications in due course. I cannot say by what time. The next is the ordinance giving relief of 0.75% interest specified the period of delay as period between due date and the date of payment. So that is correct. So this relief is only if the payment has become due between 20th March 2020 and 29 June 2020. So if it has become due earlier, then there is no relief. And the second condition is it has to be paid by 30th of June. Otherwise, there is no relief. So this is I think that is the fair interpretation.
No, but there here, when you calculate interest at the rate of 0.75%, means whether for a fraction of month you will have to calculate the full month, or for the number of days you will have to take up, Mr. Ravikant?
No.
Or part of month.
Yeah. So under the existing law, I think for the 2011A, there's a circular when it was introduced, which says that it has to be taken from the date of deduction and not from the due date. Whereas now this ordinance is saying that it is from the due date. So, it will be part of a month also will be included. But suppose you have deducted on the, say, 7th of March and due date is 30th of April. Yeah. So 7th of March and the due date is of 30th of April, then the interest will be computed from 30th of April, not 7th of March.
Okay. And suppose you make the payment, say, on 15th of May, then will you have to calculate for the full month or for just 16 days?
No, I think it will be for the full month.
Full month, no?
It will for the full month. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Uh, then one question is whether dividend from mutual fund would be subject to restricted surcharge. So this is this is dividend from. I need to check that point. I have not applied my, but by reading perhaps it is only the dividend from companies and not for mutual fund. This is I will need to check this point, because wherever the act is referring to the income from mutual fund, it says income from units of mutual fund. It does not say dividend. So my reading is that it applies only the lower surcharge applies only for the corporate dividends, direct corporate dividends. Some of the issues are little complex. I may not have answers at this moment. I'll need to think over. Now deduction under ATM is not available for computing book profit because there is no similar amendment in under 115 JB. Yeah, that is right. If you are going under 115 BAA, that is the lower tax rate under 22%, then you don't have to pay MAT. So this question will not arise and you can still claim ATM deduction. But if you have not gone under 115 BAA, then yes, you are right. Similar to normal tax, that ATM deduction is not available for computing the MAT. That has been the representation, but unfortunately that is not yet accepted. Next question is whether business trust should be read both as REITs and InvITs. I would believe so.
There is one update which has been given by Hinesh Bhai.
Yeah.
He says that as per his talks with CBDT, they are supposed to issue clarificatory circular on TDS by employers under section 192 for both options. However, that circular is delayed due to lockdown.
Okay. I'm not sure whether it is due to lockdown or whether it is due to disagreement between.
That is what Hinesh Bhai has said.
The orders have been issued.
That is what Hinesh Bhai has said.
Sure. Yeah. So if it comes, it is better. So that all then, yes. That will, if it comes, it is better.
Next question, Ravikant
Yeah,
bhai.
there are many. Yeah, just hold on.
You can get, you can
I'm just reading the question that
sure. No problem. Yeah, take it.
Yeah. So whether press note number of 2nd February of this for this deemed residency rule, whether it loses relevance, can we still say that Indian source will be taxable for 120 days rule relying on the press note? So Indian source income, I think there was no doubt. Yeah. So Indian source income there was no doubt. Even if you had these rules had not come, you were non-resident, it would have been still taxable in India.
Yes, Sanjay bhai, you were saying something?
No.
Okay.
Okay, there is one question about TDS. So how will 1 crore limit be calculated for this? I think this is for the cash withdrawal. Is it withdrawal from 1419? So I think even earlier, for when the provision had come from 1st of September 2019, it was clarified that the 1 crore limit is qua the full financial year. So it will, for this 1/4/2020, for the financial year 2021, it will be counted from 1st of April 2020. Next is, when will TDS be deducted if returns are not filed for 3 consecutive years? So I just discussed, there will be certain operational problems depending upon the interpretation one takes. So for the different due dates. So once before the due date, you have to take one set of 3 years. After the due date, you have to take another set of 3 years. Now there could be problems that if the limit of 20 lakhs has been already crossed before the due date, and then that for that year you were complying with, you had filed return for at least one of the 3 years, but after the current due date has passed, and there will be some requirement of catch up TDS or a retrospective TDS if now the 3 years changes. Yeah, AIF receives any dividend income, is TDS applicable? There is a notification of 2015 which relaxes the TDS provision, so that will continue to apply even for the dividend income. So whenever the company is paying any dividend to AIF, there is no need for TDS. The problem is arising for the dividend paid by SPV to the business trust, where there is no such similar notification. On this TDS on cash withdrawal, there is a question whether it will applies only to the excess of the amount. I personally believe it is applies only on the excess over 1 crore. Even if there is a language, there is a change, it refers to such sum. I personally believe it is only on the excess over 1 crore, but I think it is better that the CBDT clarifies the issue.
69 questions.
Yeah, I think there are many questions. It will be difficult for me to answer.
Fine. Ravikant bhai,
I will keep a note of all this. Yeah.
Ravikant bhai, one important issue regarding the 1050 deduction. So if we see that the equalization levy has been made applicable for the transaction from 1420, right?
Transaction 1050. Yeah, 2021 exemption provision refers to 2021, 1/4/2021.
Yeah, so the equalization levy is only for a transaction after 1420, on and after 1420. So when exemption is from exemption section is applicable from 21, so it should be applicable to AY 2021. Sorry,
no.
AY 21-22.
Yeah, I take the point. The point
AY will be 21-22 only for the period.
Yeah. So if the language had been that, one would have taken that view. Unfortunately, the language of the exemption provision under section 1050, it says it applies for any transactions entered after 1st of April 2021. So it is a transaction which are entered after 1st of April 2021, not the assessment year. So that is the difficulty in the language of this section. Had it not referred to any date, and it would have just come from assessment year 21-22, it would have applied to the financial year 2021.
Okay, thank you.
Fine, Mr. Ravikant, we are very thankful to you